In this unique video, you'll learn how living near your children as you age might impact your happiness and well-being in ways you might not have considered, and how reassessing your circumstances could enhance your quality of life. The latest revelation might surprise you. But before we dive in, I want you to pay close attention to this story, as it's essential for grasping the significant lesson of this video. Mrs. Rosa, a 70-year-old widow, decided to move in with her daughter Lucia following her husband's death. The thought of being close to her grandchildren and contributing to the household filled her with excitement. Who wouldn't want to be surrounded by loved ones in their later years? The idea of shared family life seemed like a dream realized. Mrs. Rosa felt as though she had hit the jackpot. Their days were filled with the laughter of children, delightful aromas from the kitchen, and the reassuring sense of being helpful. As she prepared breakfast for her grandchildren, she thought to herself, "This is life." Lucia's home became a haven of intergenerational harmony. Mornings passed in a blur of French toast and imaginative tales, while afternoons found Rosa assisting the little ones with their homework, reliving her teaching days. "Grandma, can you help me with math?" little Mateo asked, causing her heart to swell. A recent study from Stanford University revealed that intergenerational living can boost happiness and a sense of purpose in grandparents, and Rosa was experiencing this firsthand. She felt rejuvenated, as if she had discovered the fountain of youth in her grandchildren's smiles. However, you know the saying about things that seem too good to be true? Sometimes they are. This is where the story takes an unexpected twist. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, Rosa overheard Lucia on the phone. "Mom is a blessing. I don't know what we would do without her." While Rosa felt a surge of pride, a slight pang of something she couldn't quite place washed over her. Concern, perhaps? The philosopher Epicurus once said, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste a lot of it." Rosa began to realize that her days felt overwhelmingly busy. Where were the peaceful moments to read a good book or simply gaze out the window? Days morphed into weeks and weeks into months, establishing a routine. Breakfast, homework, lunch, more homework, and dinner. Rosa found herself reminiscing about her old apartment and the freedom to spend her time as she pleased. But then she chastised herself. "How can I be so ungrateful? I have everything I ever wanted." One Sunday morning, while making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, because let's face it, what grandma hasn't done that, Rosa realized she couldn't remember the last time she had a lie-in or enjoyed a night out with friends without fretting about returning in time for dinner. Psychologist Erik Erikson emphasized the importance of maintaining autonomy in old age, yet Rosa felt her independence slipping away amidst family affection and unspoken responsibilities. One evening, after tucking the children into bed, Rosa sat on the porch, gazing at the stars. She wondered, "Is this really what I want for the rest of my life?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, much like a balloon adrift in the night sky. The poet Robert Frost wrote, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by." Rosa pondered whether she had chosen the right path or if, in her quest to be the ideal grandmother, she had lost sight of her own journey. Before we proceed, if you find value in these videos, please subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated. Mrs. Rosa began noticing subtle shifts in her daily life. What started as occasional visits to help care for her grandchildren evolved into a constant obligation. Suddenly, she found herself changing diapers, preparing bottles, and chasing energetic little whirlwinds. Sound familiar? You are not alone. Epicurus once said, "Time doesn't stand still, and neither does life." And Mrs. Rosa began to feel the weight of these words. Her days, once filled with social activities and personal time, were now entirely consumed by the demands of her children and grandchildren. The curious thing is, Mrs. Rosa didn't complain. Like many grandmothers, she felt it was her duty to support her family. However, exhaustion began to build, accompanied by an unexplainable sense of loss. This is where the infamous slave grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it's not the title of a new Netflix series, though it certainly could be. This term, coined by Dr. Antonio Guaro, describes the emotional and physical strain grandmothers experience when taking on unpaid caregiving roles. Imagine being on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, you adore your grandchildren and cherish every moment spent with them. But on the other hand, you feel as if your life is slipping away as you change yet another diaper. It's akin to attempting to embrace a cactus, beautiful, but painful. Studies indicate that this syndrome can have dire consequences on grandmothers' mental health. The lack of recognition, physical fatigue, and loss of personal freedom can lead to depression and anxiety. It's like running an endless marathon with no one waiting for you at the finish line. Mrs. Rosa began to notice these symptoms, feeling increasingly drained, but she reassured herself that it was normal, that it was simply part of being a grandmother. But is it truly normal to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of others? Spoiler alert, it's not. Psychologist Carol Gilligan discusses the ethic of care, explaining how women in particular tend to prioritize others' needs over their own. Mrs. Rosa was living this theory firsthand, sacrificing her time, energy, and, unknowingly, her happiness. As the days passed, she found herself gazing out the window more often, yearning for her former independence. She reminisced about days spent enjoying coffee with friends without having to request permission or juggle schedules. Now those outings felt like an unattainable luxury. It's ironic, isn't it? Mrs. Rosa moved close to her children, seeking companionship and closeness, yet she felt more isolated than ever. As writer Paul Tournier once remarked, loneliness begins with family. Perhaps he was onto something. Mrs. Rosa's narrative takes an unforeseen turn. What began as a dream of familial unity morphed into a silent nightmare. Have you ever wondered how a decision made from love can lead us down an unexpected path? Lucia, Mrs. Rosa's daughter, began to reveal her true nature. One day, while Mrs. Rosa was preparing lunch, Lucia entered the kitchen with a frown. "Mom, how many times have I told you that the kids don't like onions? Why do you keep putting them in everything?" The criticism fell upon Mrs. Rosa like a bucket of cold water. This incident was not isolated. Slowly but surely, suggestions transformed into commands, and advice became reproaches. Mrs. Rosa felt her space shrinking, her voice silenced. Sound familiar? Perhaps you've experienced something similar or know someone who has. Psychologist Erik Erikson, renowned for his theory of psychosocial development, cautioned us about the importance of maintaining autonomy in old age. According to Erikson, losing independence can lead to an identity crisis and feelings of hopelessness. Isn't it ironic that, in our pursuit of support from loved ones, we risk losing something as precious as our essence? Mrs. Rosa began to feel the weight of this truth. Her days, once brimming with aspirations and dreams, were now limited to caring for grandchildren and following directives. Where was the woman who had planned to travel and acquire new skills? She faded into the background, overshadowed by the expectations of others. A study from the University of Michigan revealed that older adults who retain their independence report greater life satisfaction. Surprising, right? Consider how you would feel if someone dictated every aspect of your life. Frustration mounted in Mrs. Rosa's heart every time she heard, "You should do it this way," or "Why don't you follow my advice?" These remarks felt like tiny splinters in her self-esteem, while resentment, an unwelcome guest, began to settle in her once safe haven. One night after an especially challenging day, Mrs. Rosa found herself crying silently in her room. The walls that once offered her protection now felt like they were closing in. She felt trapped, worthless, like an old piece of furniture that no one appreciates but no one dares to discard. How many of our elders might be living this silent drama? The paradox is harsh. In seeking familial warmth, Mrs. Rosa lost the fire of her own identity. Closeness, which should have been a blessing, turned into an invisible cage. How can one escape this trap? Is it possible to regain independence while cherishing familial love? Philosopher Bertrand Russell once stated, "The purpose of life is to grow, not just physically but mentally and spiritually." Yet, how can Mrs. Rosa grow if she feels diminished in her own home? Prepare to uncover how a lifelong friend changed Mrs. Rosa's life with advice that challenges our assumptions about aging and family. One ordinary day, Carmela, Mrs. Rosa's lifelong friend, decided to pay her a surprise visit, bringing her signature smile and a bag of freshly baked cookies. Carmela rang the doorbell, but upon entering, she was taken aback by what she saw. "Rosa, is that you? You seem different," she exclaimed, noticing her friend's dark circles and fatigued expression.